economics honors and belongs to the batch of 2010. And he was a Rhodes Scholar, went on to the University of Oxford, completed his MPhil in economics, after which he was awarded the Overseas Development Fellowship. He had a brief stint as a policy as an economist for 2 years. He worked for 2 years, and then he got back to his doctoral studies, which is now he's pursuing at the University of Oxford, and he'll be talking to us on basically the idea of the cost of being remote and distance. So geography and governance. This is some empirical, very good empirical evidence that he has to show this hypothesis. So over to Karan right now. So we'll stay with the same format. If you do have any sort of conceptual questions, you want to clear something, feel free to ask that in the middle itself. But otherwise, for a Q&A, we have some time to stay.
Just a small correction. I did not get the Rhodes Scholarship. I only had the INLAC Scholarship. The Rhodes, the interview went fine, but I was asked to name my favorite Beethoven violin concerto, and ended up naming a violin sonata. So V. Chauhan and Anantha were very upset about me for lying about my presence of music knowledge, not for economics. Thank you, Winston. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. This work is work in progress, so there'll be lots of things that I do which are wrong, and which where they're going wrong and what we need to do to improve. This is part of a much larger project with my co-authors, Sam Asher, who is now at the World Bank, and Paul Lozak, who is at College in the US. And a lot of, over the years, we have put together lots of very rich geocoded data on India. And I'll explain the source of data as we go along. And we're using this to answer questions about urban-rural linkages. We look at things like the rural effects of urban growth. When urban employment grows, jobs grow in towns and cities. What is the effect of that on the surrounding villages? This project looks more at rural public goods and tries to document the cost of remoteness for villages in India, but does it in a very local way. So I don't need to convince you that distance or physical proximity matters. The fact that when you're closer to towns and cities, you are much better off. And so it matters for rural goods and labor markets. So you can transport goods more easily. You can transport. You can migrate and you can commute much more easily. And so if you live in a village that's closer to a town or a village, you're much better. And so we have some early evidence using our own data on, how do I go to the back? So, interesting. Links to they do actually. So we have early evidence from our own work on wages that rural wages track urban wages in neighboring towns. So the higher the urban wage, the higher the rural daily wages in locations close to those places. Just go back. And what we're more interested in for the purpose of this presentation is the effect of distance on public goods. So we think that distance to town and cities matters not just because it gives you more easier access to goods and labor markets, but also gives you more access to the state. And the state is important in developing countries such as India. So it matters for things like roads, electricity, irrigation, and that has an effect on economic outcomes. So can you just click on the bin scatters? This is, trying to show you the fact that if you plot these spatial gradients of things like earnings, whether the proportion of the percentage of households in the village with solid roofs, literacy, electrification, irrigation, we find that as you move away from towns, things become worse off. And these are towns of population more than 10,000. If we can go to the next slide, which is larger cities, 100,000, you find very similar patterns. So it's not something driven by the size of the town itself, things become worse off. Which is not surprising, it's what you expect. And when you talk to Canadian audiences, they say, of course, these places are remote, they're in the middle of nowhere, so why would you spend money providing public services in these faraway locations? The costs are so high. And that might be the case, but what we're trying to do here in India is saying that these places are not actually remote in that very American West remote kind of way. These are remote very locally. So, if you can just go back there. So the fact that this spatial inequality, of course, we know that in India, places like Punjab or Haryana are different from Bihar and Odisha. Over large chunks of space, at the state level, outcomes are different. But we also find that outcomes are very different in much narrower geographical zones. So, for example, if you look at average earnings in India, 77% of the inequality in the average earnings in villages can be explained by within district factors. This is things that are happening at a much more local level. And we're trying to understand why that happens. We think that this is because of the patterns of administration, how the country is administered. That means that villages receive more public goods than their very neighboring villages. So it's not as if villages in Madhya Pradesh receive more public goods than those in Mizoram. This is saying that even within Mizoram, in a very narrow locality, you will get more or less public goods than your neighbors. So those are the themes that what this paper tries to address. Things about remoteness and spatial inequality in a very narrow geographical zone. Next slide, please. The challenge is that, so we want to focus on administration, but obviously administration in India is done through state capitals and district capitals, and these also end up being large cities themselves, they end up being large towns themselves. And so it's hard to isolate the effect of access to large markets, large urban markets, from access to places from where the state administers the country. And so what we do in this paper is try to exploit administrative boundaries that mean that your distance to administration changes by a large amount, but other things don't change. So, and I'll explain that design a little more in detail as we go forward. And we find that the more distant you are from your administrative center, which we call administrative remoteness, the fewer public goods you receive, and this has an adverse impact on economic outcomes. So this administrative remoteness, we think of it in a way as being the opposite of decentralization. So decentralization is something that brings power closer home. Administrative remoteness is the opposite, it takes power for the state further away. And the next slide, this is feeds into a much larger literature on how power dissipates over distance. So in Africa, people have written a lot of important papers on how the power of the capital diminishes with distance from the capital. So, Megapolis and Papa find that in the fringes, in the border areas, which are more distant from the national capitals, the state doesn't really make a difference. The border might as well not have existed. And I'll explain that paper because it's relevant for our design as well. Even this is not a developing country problem. Even in the US, you find that more remote state capitals in the US have higher corruption and lower public education. So this is, Karan and Go have a paper from the US where they look at, so you think about places like Albany versus Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, where some capitals are much more the hub of population in those states, and some places the capital is not where the main population is located, and you find that the more remote capitals tend to have higher corruption. And as I was saying, this feeds into a much larger literature on decentralization, which says that decentralization basically means you give power away to the local authorities. The people who actually administer your public services are the ones who are closer to you, and so therefore they have more information about you. You have more information about them, so you can demand more goods. And also they have stronger incentives to deliver. So if the panchayat is delivering something, they have a stronger incentive to deliver that than a more remote authority far away, such as a state government. And so this is trying to say, and we don't do a good job of answering this question yet, but we hope to in the next few months, is saying that as your distance to power changes, as it reduces, you get more public goods. And in India, there is some qualitative evidence from southern India, the mission of that due, and Shobha has this paper from Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, where they did small surveys in some villages in the country, in a few sub-districts in those states, and they found that the more distant you were from your sub-district headquarters, from your taluk headquarters, or mandal headquarters in Andhra, people's faith or belief in the system, in the government was weaker. So there were more reports of more corruption. There's this World Bank survey which asks you your view of the state. And people had a much dimmer view of the state when they were further away from their capitals. And what we're trying to do is do this at a much larger scale across the whole country and provide causal evidence for the negative effects of this remoteness. In India, the district administration plays a very large role in providing public goods. A lot of whether it's a federal program or a state program, the actual administration of the scheme is done by the district administration. So the district collector is kind of like the CEO of the district and goes around to all the villages and towns in the district to make sure that public goods are being delivered efficiently. And the mechanism that we are sort of getting at is the fact that the more distant you are from where this district collector administers from, the fewer visits you will receive, the more you have to rely on the local authorities, local elites, and so the public goods that you receive will be weaker in turn. That's where we're coming from. Can you move on? So the data we use comes from several different sources. One is the economic census. We don't use too much of that in the results actually today, but this basically provides you a complete enumeration of all enterprises in the country. So they go from house to house asking, is there an enterprise over here? If yes, what do you produce? How many people do you employ? And a few other questions. So for example, in 2005, we have data on about 42 million firms. Why we don't use it too much is because we don't have the 2012 numbers yet, so that will be much more useful once we get that. We have combined village and town level population censuses from 91 onwards, and the village directory in this provides you a lot of rich information on public goods available at the village level. So electrification, paved roads, schools, health centers, etc. Now, of course, and the whole presentation can be given on how good those measures are and how that process is done. But that's the best we have at the national level, right? We'll use data from the Pradhan Gram Sadat Yojana program, which my co-authors have worked a lot on. And we use project information, so we use things like cost and duration of project, of building the road per kilometer, to get at some idea of why it's more difficult to provide public goods in more administratively remote locations. And we have geocoded everything at the village and town level, so we have this data set for about 600,000 villages, 620,000 I think, and about 8,000 towns. Why 8,000 as opposed to, it's a lot more than what officially we know as towns, because, towns keep coming in and out of the census. So, and we have district boundaries, the shape files. Can you go on? And our biggest source of data is the socioeconomic caste census, which we have data on about 166 million households and 825 million individuals. This was a large census done by the UK2 government, where they wanted to use much better data, provide larger schemes. Didn't go very far, but it was a really good exercise. And they did data on household assets, on some measures of public good, on housing quality, and individual level in the education occupation. And the government was kind enough to post this data online, which my co-authors and I then scraped off. Can you go to the next slide? So this is the kind of questionnaire that the ACC asks. I'm sorry the quality isn't really clear, but basically this data was put online for you 2 days, and we scraped it, and of course, we scraped it, and these slides are basically my co-authors' desire to show how hard they worked to get this data from the internet, but then we've also officially got this data from the Chief Economic Advisor, so we can actually legally use it. It were in 20 different languages. You can just go back, sorry. 20 different languages, and hire a whole army of RAs to translate and verify the Google translations, translate about 20,000 words. Can we go on? And when we verify this, that at the district level, it makes sense by comparing it to other sources such as the NSS and the census information. Yeah.
It's not available online now. And it's been removed now.
Yes, though this, I'm never sure if it's been removed because you sometimes find that some links work and some don't. But yes, it's I think in the way it was available to us, it's not available.
And from, sorry to interrupt, but if they have the exact data sets, if you got it from the direct source, using interpolation,
Yeah.
so couldn't you have got the data without needing to scrape it and parse it?
No, because the government is very particular about not sharing data, and I think the agreement happened only because they didn't give it to us legally because we already had the data.
Okay.
But really, I think the government didn't realize what they were doing when they were putting it online. But the SCCC is now available publicly, but at a very aggregate level. So what our contribution is really to get at the village level, at the town level, which is very hard to do from what is publicly available. And we do this because we think that the existing measure that which data is reported, which is the district to sub-district level, they are too broad for us. We really want to get at a very narrow geographical resolution. Maybe more. And so this is, I'm describing each measure as we go along, but this, I don't know if this is clear. Sorry, we have a smaller summary statistic slide where we sort of divided the sample into villages that, whose distance to their district headquarters, which we use as our measure of administrative center, is less and more than the median. And we find that, as a snapshot, places that are less administratively remote, that are at a lower distance from their headquarters, have higher incomes on average, have a larger proportion of the village with solid roofs, which comes from the STC, slightly higher probability having a paved road, which comes from the population census, a lot more people working in non-farm activities, so 23 as compared to 24, and so tells us at a very high level snapshot that places that are, on average closer to their administrative centers tend to be better off than those that are further away. And there's also certain problems with this. This by itself does not tell us much, right? So many of you will know about heterogeneity, and I don't know how it was spelled when we were taught. I think there's an E missing, maybe. Huh? Yeah. Yes. I haven't had a lot of arguments for this because Mrs. Karan taught us with the E, but then in Oxford they told us the E is not there. So this is the more conventional spelling. So I'm always conflicted when I'm presenting which one should I use. Should I be toying with the roots or move with times? But as you can all tell, this distance from your district capitals is correlated to distance of large towns. You can't obviously isolate the effect of administration itself. What we're getting at is whether you're close to large towns, you're better off. When you're far away, you're worse off. Doesn't tell us that it's being caused by administration. And some places maybe historically better off. Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Nair have a paper looking at long-term outcomes of the colonial land revenue systems, and some places may have historically benefited and had better governance 200 years ago, and so you can say that those places that are near the headquarters have traditionally been better off as compared to those far away, and so you really can't claim that this difference that we observe in outcomes is because of distance from capitals today. So what we do to resolve this problem is use a spatial regression discontinuity design. I don't know, have people heard of RD? Regression discontinuity? So regression discontinuity is a way of trying to do a quasi-experiment. So instead of doing a randomized controlled trial where you say, let's give the policy to half the people and not to the other half and see what's how things evolve. In regression discontinuity, you usually use a cutoff or a threshold to say, let's compare people who are just above the cutoff with those just below the cutoff, and they're really same in all respects except that they just happen to be above or below a certain cutoff. An arbitrary cutoff, so it's not, the cutoff has not been placed there so as to keep some people up and some people below. And you compare those at the border to say, okay, these guys just managed to get the policy and these guys just didn't get the policy, and therefore any difference in outcomes that you see later on must be because of that policy. So people have used it to do things like, to affect scholarships on performance. So you say, if you give a scholarship to somebody, what does that benefit them later academic outcomes? Obviously, you know that people who get the scholarship, they were good to start off with. So if you observe that they perform very well later on, it's not because they got the scholarship, but it's because people who are really smart to start with, they get the scholarship. And so to avoid this, you say, let's say the scholarship criteria is getting 90% in some exam, then you compare those at 90.1 with those at 89.9 because they're really same. But if you 89.9, 90.1 are very small today, but if a year later you do the exam again and you find the guys who got 90.1 today get 92 and the 89.9 gets lower, then that difference can be because of the ones that 90.1 getting the scholarship. People do this in India. A lot of the impact evaluations of the NREGA program have been based on the fact that there was a staggered rollout. The planning commission had this list of most backward districts. They said we will give the NREGA first to the 200 most backward and the 200 next most backward, and so you compare the 198th worst district, the 202nd district, and say the 198 guys are the same as 202 almost, except that one of them got the NREGA 1 year before and one got 1 year after. And the PMGSY, the Gram Sadak Yojana program, had a size-based cutoff, so they were doing paving roads in villages and said, we will give the road first to those villages with more than 1,000 people, then with more than 500 people. So then you compare, say 1,000 people. So you compare, 1,000, those with 1,020 with those with 980 people, and say the guys at 1,020 are almost the same as those guys at 980, except that they got the road first. And so this is racial discontinuity. Spatial racial discontinuity makes extends this to the two-dimensional space, where you say, let's look at spatial boundaries. So the policy, as it may be flexibly interpreted, is implemented in some parts and not in others, and that boundary is drawn fairly arbitrarily. And you say the guys who are just outside the boundary just missed out, and the guys just inside just got it. And therefore, any difference in outcomes that you observe between these two sets of observations must be because of the boundary. And so, can we go to the next slide, please? The pioneering example in this was the Melissa Test 2010 paper in Econometrica, which basically looked at the long-term effects of the MITA program scheme, whatever. It's basically this colonial 16th century Spanish program where the Spanish said to the indigenous people that you must give 1/7 of your workforce, you must send them to work in the mines, the silver mines in Potosi down there, and in Guanacaste, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. And so, but the MITA was imposed in some places, not in others, and what Melissa Dale uses is this boundary effect here, so say that the guys on site over here had to send their populations to work in these places. The guys across did not, and she argues that this boundary is fairly exogenous at a very local level. So if you ended up being here or here, doesn't really matter. But if you ended up being here, you had to send your population to work here and here. But if you ended up being here, then you did. And so she finds long-term effects of the MITA, where she finds that outcomes, even today you have much worse outcomes in those places. And this basically means that there's content paper really set the standards for what a spatial RD should do and should show you. Next slide. And this is the paper I mentioned about Africa, where they say, as you may know, in Africa, how the colonialists divided Africa into modern countries was basically a conference in, I think, Berlin, where they basically said, okay, these are the lines, you take this part, we'll take this part. So if you look at the map of Africa, you actually find a lot of the boundaries as straight lines, and those lines cut through ethnic homelands. So the Kaurinde group, for example, was partitioned between Zambia and the DRC, which was the ethnic homeland, and the border now runs through it. And so what these two authors wanted to show was that does that border make a difference? So does it Zambia, we know, is a much better country today in a large range of human development outcomes than the DRC. So these are the same ethnic group. Does being in Zambia rub off on the guys who luckily ended up being on this side? And they actually use night lights to find the rational effects that Zambia, no matter how great a country it is, new development indices as compared to DRC, doesn't really have a big effect in its border areas. And so, despite the ethnic homeland being divided fairly arbitrarily between these two countries, there really is no difference. But this is the kind of thing that we want to mimic in our work, where we basically say, can you next slide please? Can you show the next slide? Talk to the picture. Right? So what we want to be able to say is compare villages on either side of district boundaries, and such that across the boundary, distance to the towns and distance to highways doesn't changes fairly smoothly. So if you look at this Nagpur-Bhandara district border over here, villages that are on Nagpur side are fairly similar to the Bhandara side in terms of their access to everything except their district headquarters. The guys on the Bhandara side have to be much closer to their district capital than those on the Nagpur side. Now, there are many reasons why that doesn't work, right? Because Nagpur traditionally, if the districts have been created in such a way that they represent, say, existing princely states, Nagpur doesn't, but let's say, then you can say, basically these villages that are on this side of the border have, for 300 or 400 years been subject to much better governance than the guys on the Bhandara side. To deal with anything, districts may have been better understood since 1947. Deal with that, we basically put in district fixed effects. We say that anything that's particular to the district's history is absorbed by the district fixed effect, and we really are taking up something. If we see an effect, it's in excess of what is a Nagpur specific factor. We also might argue that people who are on, and I don't know how to do this, but we also put a district boundary effect, so that maybe Nagpur-Bhandara boundary itself may, there may be a ridge or any specific geographical factor at the boundary, which means that places to this side of the border are different in a very fundamental, unobservable way from regions on this side of the border. And so what we're really playing off is a variation not just at this border but along the border. So the effect we will eventually end up picking up is going to be the effect of a village over here being closer to its district capital as compared to villages further up and further up the same boundary. We can go back to the previous slide. So really the regression we learned is the regression of the rural outcome, Y, V, D, where V is the village and D is the district, on the thing that we care about, distance from their district capital or district quarters, and we control for things like distance to trunk infrastructure such as highways, distance to nearest town with a population more than X thousand, so we play with 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, doesn't matter. We also control for local population density, so that that any effect we observe in terms of the rural outcome is not being driven by the fact that some parts of the some villages have more population density than others, right? Because you can argue that population density may matter for governments to provide public goods. They may provide more public goods in more dense places and fewer public goods in less dense places. And so we are saying that really the effect, the difference in outcomes that we observe is not a cause. That this beta 1 coefficient is not picking up any density relevant effects. And we control for geographic location using a linear polynomial in latitude and longitude, which basically means we control for location by putting in the latitude and the longitude. People do, instead of putting in a linear polynomial, you just control for latitude and longitude. You can also control for their squares and their cubes, and we show that it doesn't matter. So this is how people do geographic polynomials. They put in, they do linear and they show robustness to putting in geographic. Eta D is the district fixed effect, which is giving a district fixed, district specific factors such as traditionally in the state or the better governed district, or linguistic factors. Delta D E is taking up the border fixed effect, so that really what we are playing off is the variation happening along the same district border. So D is the district to which B belongs, E is the district that's closest